The sweltering Texas heat of early fall 2024 clung stubbornly to Chesterfield Academy, an imposing, ivy-clad edifice whose red brick walls had seen generations of students pass through its hallowed and increasingly creaky halls. For Sarah, the meticulous and ambitious editor of the school newspaper, the new academic year felt less about fresh starts and more about unearthing long-buried secrets. Her latest obsession, fueled by restless nights and a journalist's insatiable hunger for truth, was the legendary archive room in the basement, a place whispered about in hushed tones by generations of students, yet never truly seen. The archive room was the stuff of urban legend, a veritable time capsule of Chesterfield's entire history, rumored to contain everything from dusty yearbooks to forgotten athletic trophies, all sealed away decades ago. Principal Dawson, a man whose rigid adherence to rules was matched only by his impeccably pressed suits, had repeatedly dismissed any inquiries about the room, citing vague safety hazards and structural instability. This official stonewalling, rather than deterring Sarah, only intensified her resolve. Where there was secrecy, she reasoned, there was a story. Sarah confided in Daniel, her best friend and the undisputed tech wizard of Chesterfield Academy. Daniel, a self-proclaimed skeptic whose faith rested firmly in logic and code, initially rolled his eyes at her ghost story obsession. However, his loyalty to Sarah, coupled with an unshakable curiosity for any locked door, eventually won him over. He agreed to help her bypass the notoriously faulty security panel near the archive entrance, a task he promised would be trivial for someone with his talents. One suffocating, humid evening, long after the last student had departed and the janitorial staff had completed their rounds, Sarah and Daniel rendezvoused in the cavernous, dimly lit basement. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, decaying paper, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang, like old copper or distant, forgotten blood. The only sounds were the distant hum of the building's antiquated ventilation system and the nervous thumping of Sarah's own heart, a drumbeat against the silence. Daniel, with a few deft clicks and the quiet whir of a specialized device, bypassed the defunct alarm. The heavy steel door to the archive room, groaning in protest, swung open with an agonizing slowness, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb the meager light from their flashlights. A wave of cold air, shockingly frigid in the Texas summer, washed over them, carrying with it the undeniable aroma of dust, old books, and a faint, cloying sweetness like dried lily. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting trembling arcs through the suffocating gloom. The room was vast, far larger than Sarah had anticipated, filled to the ceiling with towering shelves of brittle yearbooks, tarnished awards, and countless forgotten boxes. The sheer volume of discarded history was overwhelming. It wasn't just old. It felt ancient, heavy with the weight of uncounted years and unspoken secrets. As they began to explore, their initial excitement slowly gave way to a creeping unease. The personal effects weren't merely stored, they felt preserved. Old leather-bound journals lay open on a dust-covered table, their faded ink still legible. Desiccated corsage rested on the cracked covers of yearbooks. Faint, sepia-toned. Photographs, many of them unlabeled, stared out from behind smudged glass, their eyes seeming to follow Sarah as she moved through the labyrinthine aisles. It was during their initial sift through a stack of old student records that the first subtle phenomena began. A distinct whisper, soft as a sigh, seemed to emanate from directly behind Sarah, though no one was there. She spun around, flashlight beam darting into the shadows, but found nothing. Daniel, engrossed in a particularly archaic-looking security log, didn't seem to notice. Just the building settling, she muttered to herself, though her skin prickled with a cold dread. Then, a stack of meticulously organized report cards on a nearby shelf gently, almost imperceptibly, shifted, sliding a fraction of an inch to the left. Daniel, who had just turned, saw it this time. His skeptical brow furrowed. "Huh," he mumbled, reaching out to touch them. The air around the stack was noticeably colder, even in the already frigid room. Their logical explanations, drafts, vibrations felt increasingly inadequate against the undeniable strangeness. As the night wore on, the whispers in the archive became more frequent, more insistent, though still unintelligible, like a multitude of voices speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. Objects would gently rock, or papers would rustle on unseen currents. Sarah, her heart hammering, knew this was no ordinary archive. This room wasn't just holding history. It was breathing it, sighing it, its very air thick with the forgotten. Stories of Chesterfield Academy, stories that seemed to be slowly, insidiously awakening around them. The morning after their clandestine visit to the archive room, Sarah and Daniel exchanged nervous glances in the bustling hallway, the normalcy of student life feeling almost surreal after their unsettling experience. The chill from the basement seemed to cling to them, a phantom cold that no amount of Texas sun could dispel. Sarah, fueled by an extra-large coffee and an insatiable need to understand, found herself more driven than ever to uncover the truth. Behind Chesterfield Academy's disquieting whispers, their initial plan was simple. Compare the strange phenomena in the archive room to any new incidents reported around the school. What they discovered sent a fresh wave of dread through them. The subtle disturbances they had experienced in the basement were now echoing throughout the entire academy, intensifying with each passing day, affecting students and staff who had no knowledge of their late-night excursion. Messages, written in that same archaic, cursive script, began appearing on blackboards in various classrooms, often after hours, even in rooms that were routinely locked. They weren't just random phrases. They were fragmented lines of poetry or snippets of dates and names that Sarah recognized from the journals they had briefly glimpsed in the archive room. The faint scent of lily, once confined to Mr. Albright's classroom, now seemed to drift through the main office and even the gymnasium. The locker incidents escalated from mere rearrangements to unsettling displays. Students would open their lockers to find school supplies meticulously organized into cryptic symbols or patterns, often mimicking diagrams Sarah had seen in an old, scientific-looking journal found in the archive. Other times, personal items would be missing, only to reappear days later in the lockers of completely different students, creating confusion and minor panic. One afternoon, during a particularly intense football practice, a jarring cacophony erupted from the boys' locker room. Coach Jenkins, usually unflappable, emerged pale and shaken, claiming he heard a distinct, off-key nursery rhyme emanating from the showers, followed by the sound of invisible children giggling. He'd swept the room, finding nothing, but the sheer terror in his eyes was undeniable to Sarah, who happened to be nearby with her camera. Emily, a popular and pragmatic junior, reported a terrifying experience in the school's main hall. While hurrying to class, she glanced into the reflection of a large trophy case and saw not her own face, but the fleeting, distorted image of a young girl with long dark hair, her eyes wide with a profound sadness. Emily swore the girl's lips moved, forming a silent plea before the image vanished. The incident left Emily trembling and tearful, a stark departure from her usual composed demeanor. The school library, once a bastion of academic calm, transformed into a hub of paranormal activity. Books would not only fall from shelves, but sometimes rearrange themselves to spell out words or phrases that mirrored concerns Sarah had read in the old student journals. Lost, forgotten, help us. The ancient grand piano in the reading nook no longer played simple nursery rhymes. It now played melancholic, complex classical pieces from a bygone era, its ghostly notes echoing through the hushed stacks. Principal Dawson, his face increasingly drawn and his suits appearing less pristine, called an emergency faculty meeting. The official explanation remained pranksters, but the thinly veiled fear in his voice and the worried, exhausted faces of the teachers told a different story. The attempts to contain the spreading anxiety were failing, and the whispers about Chesterfield's curse were now common currency among the students. Sarah and Daniel spent every spare moment in the newspaper office, cross-referencing the new incidents with their limited notes from the archive. They started noticing patterns, correlations between the specific phenomena and the nature of the personal effects they had disturbed. It was as if each object, each journal, each photograph was a trigger, unleashing a specific, unresolved echo from the past, a tormented spirit crying out for recognition. The chilling truth was slowly dawning on them. The forgotten students weren't just a collective, mournful presence. They were individuals, their unique sorrows and traumas now manifesting through the very objects they had left behind. And by opening the archive room, Sarah and Daniel hadn't just uncovered history. They had woken something, given voice to something that had been silenced for decades, and now it was actively reaching out, demanding to be heard, demanding their attention. The dawning realization that they had, in essence, unleashed Chesterfield Academy's past, propelled Sarah and Daniel into a frantic, desperate research endeavor. The newspaper office became their command center, strewn with printouts of historical records, cryptic journal entries, and their own meticulous notes on the escalating paranormal activity. The chill from the archive room seemed to permeate even this space, clinging to the air, making every long night feel colder than the last. They focused their efforts on the specific period hinted at in the journals, the late 1950s to early 1960s. The archive's contents from this era were particularly unsettling, more personal effects than usual, many of them seemingly abandoned rather than simply stored. There were diaries with missing final pages, class photos with faces scratched out, and school play programs featuring actors whose names were crossed through with a hasty, violent stroke of ink. The messages on the blackboards grew more explicit. No longer mere poetry fragments, but specific, harrowing dates, often followed by chillingly short, simple phrases. DEC 14 nitrogen monoxide, Jan 21 trapped, FEB 3 silenced. These dates corresponded with the times when students in the unearthed journals spoke of a growing sense of dread, or hinted at a secret they were desperate to uncover, only to have their entries abruptly cease. The spectral manifestations around the school also became more targeted. Emily, who had seen the girl in the trophy case reflection, reported waking up to the faint, sad strains of the library piano playing right outside her bedroom window, miles from the school. Other students who had interacted with specific items from the archive began to experience localized cold spots, phantom touches, and the distinct, overwhelming scent of lily that clung to their clothing for hours. Sarah stumbled upon a series of old, discolored blueprints for the academy tucked away in a brittle folder. They revealed that a significant portion of the current school, specifically the library wing and the old theater, was built directly on the foundations of a much older institution, a children's asylum that had mysteriously closed its doors. In the early 1960s, after a series of unexplained disappearances, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to click into place, forming a terrifying picture. Their investigation became a solitary, isolating pursuit. Principal Dawson, overwhelmed and increasingly agitated by the persistent rumors of hauntings, outright banned Sarah from the archive room, threatening suspension. The other teachers, while silently acknowledging the strangeness, were too afraid to openly discuss it, retreating into a facade of normalcy. Only Coach Jenkins, watching Sarah's growing exhaustion and desperation, seemed to offer any solace, his gruff demeanor softening into a quiet, knowing concern. One late evening, as Sarah meticulously pieced together dates and names, Coach Jenkins found her in the newspaper office, a thermos of hot cocoa in hand. He didn't question her presence or her work, merely sat opposite her, his gaze heavy with unspoken history. "You're looking for answers, aren't you, Sarah?" he rumbled, his voice low. "About what happened here. About the ones they don't talk about." He began to speak, his voice a gravelly whisper of an unspoken era in Chesterfield Academy's history, a time when a select group of students, mostly those considered troublesome or unruly, were quietly sent to the annex, the old asylum wing. He spoke of the harsh disciplinary methods, the experiments disguised as therapy, and the increasing number of children who simply vanished without a trace. Their worried parents met with cold dismissals and vague reassurances. "They just stopped coming back," Coach Jenkins said, his eyes distant, haunted by memories. "And the school, the faculty at the time, they just covered it up, buried it. When the asylum shut down, they built over it, tried to bury the truth too." He confessed that he, as a young student athlete, had briefly known some of those disappeared children, and had seen things, heard things, that had kept him silent and terrified for decades. As he spoke, the air in the office grew colder. The whispers around them intensified, coalescing into discernible words. Help US, trapped. Free US. The scent of lily, now overpoweringly sweet and cloying, filled the room. Sarah looked at Daniel, whose face was pale with a dawning horror. They weren't just unearthing a tragedy. They were being overwhelmed by it, the collective sorrow of the forgotten students now demanding more than just recognition. It was demanding justice, demanding to be freed. The chilling revelations from Coach Jenkins, combined with the escalating supernatural activity, painted a horrifying picture of Chesterfield Academy's past. Sarah and Daniel knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that the forgotten students were desperately trying to communicate the full, unvarnished truth of their demise. Their initial journalistic curiosity had morphed into a desperate mission to bring peace to the tormented souls and expose the dark secret buried beneath the school. They returned to the archive room that very night, armed with Coach Jenkins's fragmented recollections and a grim determination. The cold was profound, the air thick with the metallic scent and the cloying sweetness of lily. The whispers were no longer indistinct. They were a cacophony of individual voices, overlapping in their pleas, guiding Sarah and Daniel through the labyrinthine shelves, urging them towards a specific section of the room. Their flashlights, seemingly drawn by an unseen force, landed on a particularly old, unassuming wooden cabinet, distinct from the steel shelving. It looked too small to hold much, almost an afterthought in the design of the room. As they approached, the whispers intensified, coalescing into a unified, desperate wail. Open IT. Open IT. The cabinet vibrated subtly, a faint, rhythmic knocking emanating from within, as if something trapped inside was desperate to get out. Daniel, his hands trembling, found a hidden latch on the side of the cabinet, cleverly disguised by an intricate carving. With a click, the cabinet door swung open, revealing not more documents, but a small, dark void. Sarah, pushing past her fear, reached into the blackness, her fingers brushing against cold, stiff fabric. She pulled out an old, blood-stained athletic uniform, bearing a faded number and a single, crudely embroidered initial, J. Beneath the uniform lay a brittle, leather-bound diary, even older and more fragile than the others they had found. Its final pages, unlike the others, were not missing but fused together with what looked like dried, dark blood. As Sarah carefully peeled them apart, a chilling vision erupted, not just in her mind, but physically manifesting in the archive room. The cold intensified to an unbearable degree, and the faint outlines of spectral figures shimmered into existence around them. Gaunt, terrified children, their eyes wide with incomprehension and pain. The walls of the archive seemed to ripple, transforming for a terrifying moment into the grim tiled walls of the asylum's annex. The sounds of distant, muffled screams, the clanging of metal, and the chilling, triumphant cackle of an unseen, malevolent presence filled the air. The diary's last entry, written in a child's shaky hand, detailed horrifying treatments, electric shocks, forced isolation, strange, painful experiments conducted by the asylum staff, all under the guise of therapy for unruly students. It spoke of classmates vanishing, of chilling discoveries in the basement, of a desperate, futile attempt to warn others, before ending with a final, desperate plea for justice and release, the ink smeared by what could only be tears. Or blood. As Sarah and Daniel absorbed the full horror of the forgotten atrocities, the spectral activity reached a crescendo. The room was filled with the silent, desperate faces of the forgotten students, their forms solidified, their eyes fixed on Sarah and Daniel with an unbearable intensity. It was a shared vision, a forced memory, imprinting the raw agony of their collective trauma onto their minds, ensuring they bore witness to the unspeakable. Then, as suddenly as it began, the visions vanished. The cold receded, the metallic scent dissipated, and the archive room returned to its dusty, silent state. The uniform lay on the floor, its bloodstains a stark reminder, and the diary lay open, its last entry a chilling testament. Sarah and Daniel stood trembling, utterly shaken, but also burdened by a terrible, undeniable truth. They tried to report it, to expose the horrifying history. They presented the uniform, the diary, their research, and their own first-hand accounts of the paranormal activity to Principal Dawson, to the school board, even to the local police. But there was no physical evidence the police could use, no way to verify the spectral manifestations. Principal Dawson dismissed it as an elaborate student prank, a desperate cry for attention, fueled by local legends. The school board covered it up, fearing scandal. The police, of course, couldn't help. There was no crime they could investigate, no culprit they could arrest. The truth, too disturbing, too unbelievable, was once again buried. Months later, Chesterfield Academy returned to its usual rhythm, the whispers of haunting fading into quaint rumors among new students. Sarah and Daniel, now graduated, carried the heavy burden of the unwritten epilogue, the knowledge that the forgotten students remained trapped, their cries unheard by anyone but themselves. Sometimes late at night, Sarah would still catch the faint scent of lily on the wind, or hear a distant off-key nursery rhyme on the periphery of her hearing. And she knew that the true horror of Chesterfield Academy wasn't the ghosts, but the unsettling fact that some truths are too disturbing to ever be truly believed, leaving the silent, unquiet past to continue its haunting vigil within its old, sprawling walls.